the print is perfect for examining it because it has that sort of relationship between being at once unique and part of a whole.
Hello, print friends, and welcome. I'm your host, Miranda Metcalf, and I release weekly episodes with people in the print world who share our love of printmaking. So if you like what we do, you can join us over on Patreon to receive bonus content, or just tell a fellow print friend about the podcast so they can enjoy it too. Once again, thank you to every print friend who shared and supported our goal of raising funds for transcripts for our first 100 episodes. We did it. Be on the lookout for those appearing this week on helloprintfriend.com. Speaking of that Patreon page, that is where supporters can join at tiers that start at just $1 a month, and it really helps us to keep bringing you printmaking content every week. You also get thank yous like exclusive merch and access to our bonus content, Shop Talk with our editor, Timothy Pauschak. These are quick and dirty tips and tricks with our guests about materials, processes, business advice, and just general studio nonsense. So if that sounds like something you're interested in, you can check out the link in the show notes and hear Tim's chat with today's guest. If you want to save a little cash and still support the show, you can now sign up for yearly subscriptions and save 15% off the tier price. Printmaking forever, shun the non-believers. Hello Print Friend is brought to you by Speedball Art Products, who've been offering a diverse range of high-quality products to your practice since 1997. Products like their line of professional screen printing tools. Speedball believes that professional-grade quality doesn't have to ruin your budget. Their aluminum squeegees, scoop coaters, and high mesh count screens are perfectly suited to outfit your workspace without changing your books from black to red. So, if you want to upgrade your space from hobbyist to pro, head on over to Speedball's website to see where you can pick up your new favorite setup. There's a link in the show notes. My guest this week is Ben Rak, our print friend from Down Under and a Ph.D. candidate at the University of New South Wales in Sydney, Australia. We'll talk about coming to printmaking through photography, why you should just stop worrying about whether or not you're an artist and just be one, commercial print practices, collaboration, impressions management, and the performance of print. So, without further ado, sit back, relax, and prepare to examine the masks you wear with Ben Rak. Hi Ben, how's it going?
Good, Miranda. I'm doing pretty well. How are things treating you in Thailand?
They're good. A little bit of a lockdown right now, but that's life right now, I think. So hard to really complain at this point. Yeah. I'm really excited to talk to you because you were one of really my first print friends, I think, because I met you at San Francisco SGCI when I was pretty fresh out of graduate school and had only been working at Davidson Galleries, I think at that point, for maybe only a handful of months, really, before I ended up going to that conference. And I remember that I met you and Mike and Jason kind of all there, and Kong, of course, who's also been on the podcast. And so, I don't know, it's just wonderful that we live and work in a art community where I can talk to you again and get updates on what you're working on. I don't know, like 6 odd years later or something, and that we get to stay in touch. Yeah.
Yeah, I remember that when we met. We were on we went to one of the events of the conference that was outside of the downtown area, and we were waiting for a bus to take us back so that we could do the Crown Point press tour. And there was some sort of a stuff up with the buses, and then we were all sitting around there, and we bumped into you and just started a conversation.
Yeah. It's just so. As I always said, printmaker's the best. So yeah. But so for people who maybe haven't known you and your work for the last 6 years, would you please let people know who you are, where you are, and what you do?
All right. So my name is Ben Rak. I'm a printmaker that's based in Sydney, Australia. I was born in the United States. I grew up in Israel until the age of 21, at which point I migrated to Australia and started um, started practicing art or studying art, doing my undergraduate degree in Sydney. And that's basically my personal history.
Mm-hmm.
As far as what I do is I practice mostly using silkscreen techniques, but I have been I've done projects across media, so I do also installation work. I've worked a bit with ceramics. I've worked a bit with glass. I've done some video work. I work with photo media. But all in all, my interests and my passions lie in printmaking. And I'm also an educator at the University of New South Wales. I've been lecturing there casually since about 2012, mostly in the printmaking
Mm-hmm.
classes.
Excellent. And so, what role did art play in your life growing up? Like, when did you first sort of get exposed to it and start to feel yourself drawn to it? Like, it might be something you want to build a life around.
Um, so that's an interesting question. My parents had art at home, and if we were traveling, then maybe we'd go to an art museum. The sort of let's call it cultural activity that my parents were more interested in me pursuing was music. So
Mm.
I studied the clarinet when I was young for many years, and my parents would take me quite often to see the Tel Aviv Philharmonic Orchestra. So that sort of classical music grounding. But that never really took off for me. It's not. I don't think it's really what I was passionate about.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and I do remember. I do remember instances, there's this whole thing about what do you want to do when you grow up. So
Mm-hmm.
I remember instances in my early teenage years where I thought to myself, "Oh boy, I'd really like to be an artist, but I don't know how to make art, because I couldn't, or quote unquote, couldn't draw.
Yeah.
I I couldn't paint, again, quote unquote, couldn't
Mm-hmm.
paint, and I couldn't sculpt. And to my mind, that's what art was.
Right.
So that sort of that notion of being an artist sort of fell to the wayside at that time. Because I had friends that could paint, realistic paintings and could draw drawings that looked like what they were supposed to look like, and I sort of felt that I don't have the talent to be an artist because I don't do that stuff.
Mm.
Um, Needless to say, looking back, that's not. I don't think that's the way to look at how to become an artist. And maybe if I'd been exposed to people that were practicing artists at the time, or if there was someone in my family that was a practicing artist, then there could have been maybe some guidance to sort of help achieve that how to go on that path of becoming an artist.
Mm.
So, saying that, my uncle is an amateur sculptor, and he did try giving me a few tools and some advice, but it never sort of took off. So art wasn't really in my mind when I was a teenager, or when I was growing up. It wasn't sort of what I was interested in doing or planning to do in a way.
Mm-hmm.
I was very interested in photography, but I was interested in photography in the sense of, imagine National Geographic magazine and
Yeah.
these sort of, technically perfect landscapes and beautiful pictures of animals. And it didn't, again, in my mind, it didn't occupy that same territory as art,
Mm-hmm.
which I still don't know if it does or doesn't, but
That'll be the
but
next
that
PhD. Yeah. Yeah.
well, the interest in photography did lead me directly to where I am today. So I guess you can draw lines that far back, but not. I didn't see it as an art practice at the time.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I just am hearing your story and thinking about how me growing up in teenage years wanting to be an artist myself, wanting to be an artsy kid, having no particular gifts in actual any sort of reproduction sort of images, again, whether drawing or sculpting or painting or sketching. And so being like, well, I could just be a photographer because that's you can be an artist, you don't have to draw, you know? So I don't know if a lot of kids do that, but yeah. And so then, you know, what kind of was that line between, I guess, photography and where you are now, and where does printmaking fall into this?
Well, when I came to Australia, I came here primarily on a surfing trip, and ended up. It's now 20 years later, and I'm still here on my surf trip. So
Uh-huh.
I think it was a pretty good trip as far as
Endless
I'm
summer.
concerned.
Yeah, yeah.
Something like that, yeah. But at one point, after a year or a year and a half of being here, I wanted to study something, and I was throwing up between studying, going and doing an art degree and studying photography at an art school, or getting a vocation, which I was working as a cook at the time, and so I was thinking of getting a chef's qualification. And what I decided in the end to do was I got my qualification as a to be a certified chef, and that gave me the skills and the opportunity to work in kitchens. After which I enrolled at art school and started training as an artist, all the time still working in the kitchens
Mm.
to make a living. Now, you asked how the photography thing led to printmaking. So I went to art school thinking I'm going to major in photography or photomedia. And after the first semester in photography, I realized that it was completely separated from what my vision or expectations of
Mm.
photography are.
Mm-hmm.
And they were teaching sort of a conceptually underpinned photographic practice. And I was interested in learning how to take beautiful photos.
Mm.
And I was told by the teacher basically that I have to go to a technical college to study that.
Huh.
So I took a general education class in printmaking, which was a screen printing class, and that sort of opened my eyes to this media or practice way of practicing that had completely been it had never been something that I had considered. It was never something. It was not in my mind. I didn't know anything about printmaking. I didn't know what printmaking was. I didn't know who made prints or anything like
Mm-hmm.
that. But this screen printing general elective that I took demonstrated for me a way to use my photographic skills or practice in a way that I found interesting because of the material language or the skills and techniques and process that are associated with the field of printmaking. So I switched my major over to printmaking. I was very lucky to have a fantastic teacher. I had multiple fantastic teachers, but the head of printmaking at the College of Fine Arts at the time was Michael Kempson, who I know you know well.
Mm-hmm.
And Michael's a fantastic artist, but he's also a fantastic and passionate educator. And so I had the I had the great opportunity to be mentored by him and to absorb so much printmaking and art knowledge, and that sort of led to my being passionate about the media and primarily practicing in that media.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's incredible how much having the right mentor can really open up parts of the art world to us that we wouldn't have even considered otherwise. You know, just seeing another person's passion and that that person knows how to connect with you, it makes a huge difference and can really form the path of people's lives. Yeah. So, having known your practice for a few years now, I feel like you're a printmaker who isn't necessarily satisfied interacting with the medium in a way that is just sort of given to you. You know, you want to be a little bit of trouble with it and kind of explore um, different ways of using it, different ways of interacting with it, different ways of dealing with expectations. Was that early on in your practice that you started to kind of say, like, okay, like I'm being told this is sort of the standard way of producing an image, but I want to do more? Like, how did that kind of vein of using printmaking in outside the traditional boxes begin for you?
I think it started at the end of my undergraduate studies. So how an art degree is structured here in Australia is that you have a 3-year degree, and then you can undertake an additional fourth year, which is your honors year, which is already a self-directed research project to a certain extent. And for the first 3 years of my undergraduate studies, I was making fairly traditional screen prints, etchings on paper, sort of what you expect a print to look like, a two-dimensional artwork framed on the wall. Um, and then during my honors project, I started actually working onto different materials, working onto stainless steel, using sort of resin finishes to coat the work and achieve these sort of very high gloss finishes to the work. And at the time, I was thinking it was being experimental, but looking back, you realize that all these sort of processes are very, very traditional, but associated with the commercial craft of printing. So sign makers print on steel all the time and resin coated, and they're doing all these sort of cutout shapes and making these sort of prints on a day-to-day basis that I consider to be outside of the
Right,
box.
you're being so avant-garde. Yeah.
But in a way, they are outside of the box in a way because they become prints that don't look like prints
Yep.
anymore.
Mm-hmm.
There's this notion of the print, the printerly print, the print that looks like a print and fulfills the viewer's expectation of what a print is supposed to be. And so with these pieces that I was making at that time on metals or on glass, I was working on glass and creating these sort of multi-layered objects. Then those prints were starting to appear to the viewer as something other than a print.
Mm.
And that we can talk about it
Yeah.
later on, but that's sort of where my practice is very much anchored right now.
Yeah, definitely. I have that. I've got, yeah, I'm excited to kind of get there, but I don't want to skip over throwdown press, because this was something where I think you saw a lot of these experimentations happen. And so I don't know if maybe you could speak to sort of throwdown press and the idea behind it, and then maybe give us a couple examples of some of that print that doesn't look like a print that came out of those collaborations.
Sure. Throwdown Press is an initiative that I um, founded with a good friend who's also a friend of yours, Jason Fu,
Mm-hmm.
in 2012. And Jason and myself, were working with Michael Kempson in Cicada Press, which is Michael's publishing outfit. And we were editioning prints. We were working as editioning printmakers or helping to process the plates for the artists and just interact with the artists as general studio hands. But what we saw from that is that there's this whole possibility of collaboration between a master printer and an artist that has the potential to create innovations. Let's say, I don't know if they're innovations in the field, but just create innovations in the way you think about the medium. And so Jason and myself, what we wanted to do was we wanted to start the same sort of custom printing model as Cicada Press, but geared towards inviting emerging artists and high-level art students to come and make some prints with us where they had no background in printmaking. So the idea was to get artists that were painters or ceramicists or performance artists to come and work with us for a period of time, let's say 3 months, and have them develop a body of work with our technical expertise and their their practice. And so we wanted to see how these artists who were basically thrown into the deep end, so to speak, how they would approach the medium without being encumbered by the traditions and conventions of printmaking, and how they would approach the medium not having to refine any skills. So Jason and I brought the printmaking skills to the table, and we would have like long conversations with the artists about what they want to do, and once we know what they want to do, what is possible, what isn't possible, or the most exciting option is what isn't possible, but let's think about how to actually get it done.
Mm-hmm.
And we ended up working at that time with a first group of, I think, 4 artists that produced an exhibition's worth of fairly traditional prints, but ones that really fit into their practice in what I thought was an interesting way.
Mm-hmm.
So we did that, and then since then we've been working basically on an invitation basis. I'm not too like Throwdown Press doesn't occupy a lot of my time and energy.
Yeah.
I activate it occasionally to do a project or to work with someone specific or to apply for certain grants. So I have this sort of snooze mode for it where I might put it to sleep for a year and then say, oh, I want to do this, and I'll talk to someone.
Yeah, like a superpower you can call on when needed. Yeah.
Yeah, I don't know how many superpowers exist in the printmaking world, but yeah. So since then, I've done some really really interesting projects with a bunch of artists, and some of them. I really like this project that I did with an artist called Anna Christensen, where I helped her make these really large scale screen printed paintings, which you can look up on her website. I think Anna Christensen, and the series. I think the series was called Render, but I thought that the outcomes of that were really great. There was another artist that I worked with that wanted to print onto kangaroo hides, so we did that. And basically, I get calls from artists that want to do screen printing projects that are either low edition or no edition screen printing projects that you won't find a commercial printer that's prepared to do that. So I end up with artists coming to me who want to basically use screen printing in a way that's a little bit experimental, and I get to work with them and sort of work out the quirks of their projects, and we all have a great time doing it. Most recently, I actually got a grant to expand Throwdown Press into book and zine publishing.
Nice.
And so I published a great little book. I published 3 books initially, one for myself, one for an artist, Lisa Wolfe, who's a local Sydney-based artist. But then the one I wanted to mention was someone you had on your show before, which is Tony Curran, a good friend of mine.
Tony.
And we published a book together, his book. It's called Signature. Fantastic book. I love it. But me and Tony, we've worked quite a bit. I think he mentioned Throwdown Press when he was when he was talking to you as well.
Yeah, I feel like, we're all, this is such like a print friends chat. I feel like, cause it's like, it's Tony and Michael and Jason and Ben. And like, it's just so nice. But yeah, so if that's sort of, I feel like that's a good segue to kind of bring us from the past, into the present Ben Rak moment. So yeah, so you're working on the PhD. It sounds like you're kind of right in the heart of it. Can you talk to us about what you're working on? And I think particularly as it relates to what you were saying before about, what printmaking is and how do we define it in a print that doesn't look like a print and all of that kind of stuff. You could give us your I'm doing the PhD story.
Sounds good to me. I'll give you the long version and you can feel free to edit it down if you want. So the reason it's a long version is because what I've realized when I started doing my PhD is that my practice over the past 15 years, if you look at it, it seems aesthetically very diverse. Mm-hmm. And I go from one aesthetic to another aesthetic, from creating series that looks like this to a series that looks like that to a series that looks like that. But what I've come to realize, having started doing the research for my PhD, is that there is a very consistent strand running through the practice over this decade and a half. And it was very exciting for me to realize that everything I've ever made makes sense within this one paradigm, whether I knew it at the time or not. Because obviously I didn't know it at the time that there's this sort of overarching theme to it. But now I look back and it all just slots perfectly into this one sort of area that I'm looking at right now. And it just makes me very happy to see that there's that sort of level of consistency in the practice and in the interrogation. So going back, way back when I migrated to Australia, then I like I said, I migrated to Australia and I started art school. And how I saw it at the time was the work was about the relationship between the one and the many, the single and the multiple. Which, again, looking back, the print is perfect for examining it because it has that sort of relationship between being at once unique and part of a whole. So that sort of, at the time, I thought that interest was coming from me being an immigrant and sort of struggling with usual immigrant issues of like developing a new social network and making new friends and having to accommodate this feeling of not belonging or this feeling of isolation within a Sydney, a global metropolis sort of thing. And then as I progressed over the years with my practice, it started becoming more and more about how people perform themselves. So about performed identities. And I was looking at it mostly through the context of a consumer culture. So this idea that we are all performing ourselves based on media narratives and sort of advertising gimmickry that we're being fed from a young age.
Is that kind of like you are what you buy kind of a thing, that like, do I buy like stevia flavored organic soda or do I buy Diet Coke, and like what does that say about me, like that kind of a thing?
Very much so. That's very much part of it, this sort of idea that we fulfill our image of ourselves by buying certain goods or by affiliating ourselves with certain brands. The car we buy, the clothes we wear, the style of clothes we wear. And so those all fall into this broader idea of the performed self, that in essence, all of our identities are a performance. So I was working around that idea for quite a long time, for probably 8 or 10 years, and mostly using the content of the artwork, so the imagery that I was working with, to examine that idea of performed self and consumerism. So for many years, I was working with patterns that were derived from barcodes, and I would take the barcode pattern and then I would break it apart into image components and set the barcodes into different colors and screen print them in the different colors to sort of create composite images that were derived from these barcode patterns. I was doing that for a while, and then I decided to drop the barcode pattern and just focus on the imagery that's in the images. And the more I was working with this content that was about performed selves, I realized that actually the medium of the print is situated in a place that's really good to metaphorically examine the same sort of idea. And that was the hook for my PhD project, basically. What I sort of came across at the beginning of my PhD is that in the performed self, there is this idea of impression management, which is a a term coined by a sociologist called Irving Goffman in his book, The Presentation of Self in Everyday Life. And he calls these performances that we enact in every social situation, he calls that impression management, because we're trying to manage the impression that we're leaving on other people. And it all clicked for me when I realized that printmaking is essentially impression management as well. And so what I'm now really interested in looking at is how can the material language of the print, so the signifiers of how the work was made rather than the content of the work, how can those signifiers of the material language or the syntax of the artwork speak metaphorically to these sort of ideas of impression management, performed selves, and authentic or inauthentic performances. I hope you're following with me so far.
I'm here. I'm here with you. Yeah. And so when you say, though, that sort of print is kind of performing, what do you sort of mean by that, I guess?
So if you think about, let's say you go to the doctor, when he comes to treat you, he's performing doctor to you.
Right.
Because that's what's going to make you trust him as a doctor.
Right. Like if he came
if he
in
shows up
as
a clown, then you'd be like, oh, you know what? I'm not sure about this doctor.
Yeah. Or a surfer, or interesting.
Uh-huh. Yeah. So everybody is performing, in a sense, performing themselves to other people, and those performances change. We're not a fixed performance, and so what I was saying before about a print that looks like a print is essentially a print that is performing print.
Yeah.
What do we expect of a print that's performing print? Usually we expect it to be on paper. We expect very often, with the exception of, well, not the exception, but usually we think of the print as monochrome. We think about the image consisting of hatching or cross-hatching, or in the case of photographic images, we think of them consisting of halftones.
Yeah.
So these are all signifiers in the way the print performs print.
You know, one of the things that I'm sort of infected with from this job is that if there's a print in a film, even if it's in the background, I always hit Tim and go, print, because it's like, because there are things that a print looks like that makes it read to you, this is a print. It's framed, it's under glass, it's, as you said, like black and white. It has these different markers that even if it's passing in the background in an old film, I can have an excuse to, give Tim a smack and say print, like, because there it is. Yeah.
Absolutely. So I was at a flea market today, and I'm walking and I see an image in a frame, and from 10 feet away, I say to myself, oh, that's a print, because the lines are fuzzy. I can tell straight away that it's a dry point,
Right. Yeah.
And so all these signifiers are what I call the material language of the work, or the syntax of how the work was made. And they are instrumental in the artwork performing to the viewer a certain media, for example. So when the print performs print, it looks like a print, and the viewer has certain expectations of that. And those expectations also affect how the artwork is perceived within the contemporary art world hierarchy, for example.
It's going to be cheaper.
It's going to be cheaper, or it's not as important, or lots of hierarchical
I wonder what the artist's real medium of choice is. Yeah.
Yeah, all these sort of questions come up. And so what I'm looking at now in my practice is what are the ways that the material language of the print can be manipulated in order for the resulting artwork to pass for something else, or appear to the viewer as a painting or video work, or just not a print. And that also goes back to that sort of what I was telling you about the prints on metal that I was doing, even though they were screen printed and they were prints, they could also pass as not prints.
Right.
Andy Warhol, perfect example of that sort of situation.
Yeah.
Some might say Andy Warhol's work is categorized as painting mostly because it's on canvas. I would actually say that there are other nuances in the work that subconsciously get the viewer to categorize it as not print.
Is like scale one of them, or?
I think scale is one of them, and what I'm seeing now more and more is that uncontrolled impression management is one of those key factors that allows the viewer to suspend their belief of the print or to accept the work as a not print, because the expectation of a print is control. And
control, precision, the ability
exactly.
to reproduce a perfect edition.
Exactly.
Oh, that's so interesting. So that through Warhol's just rejection of the need to get his silkscreen lines perfect, that sort of subconsciously lets the viewer be like, oh, well, this isn't a print. He's just using screen print to make a painting.
Yes. So his misregistrations, his screens clogging up, his glitches, the places where the canvas sort of folds over itself and it doesn't sort of print in the fold. All these are, to my opinion, imperfect impression management as far as the print process goes, which allows the viewer to consider the work as a painting in this case.
No, that's a really lovely, I think, concrete example of what you're talking about, which I really appreciate, because I feel like sometimes in art theory, you can sort of talk someone down a rabbit hole, and then you get to a point where you're like, okay, but does this even happen in real life? Like, what's happening, But it's so nice to actually hear that, like, yeah, so here's, one of the top 5 artists that people have heard of actually engaging in what you're talking about. So then how is this sort of showing up in your own exploration in your personal practice then?
So what I've been doing recently is, because I work with screen prints a lot or with the screen printing technique, I've been trying this what I call the unhinged screen print. So I found that by unhinging the screen from the traditional hinges or brackets that are used to control the movement of the screen, by unhinging the screen and holding it in my hand, it unhinges the identity of the artwork in the end and allows for the work to pass as a painting. So I'm taking the screen in my hand and I'm using one screen almost like a paintbrush or a stamp, and I'm using the squeegee to push the paint through the stencil, but I'm hand holding it and I'm moving it across a large canvas and intuitively building up an image in a way that, materially speaking, speaks more to the act of painting than printmaking, because I am letting go of that sort of element of control that is required for a print to be perfect or reproducible, or all these sort of things that you were mentioning before, the cleanliness of the print and the reproducibility and the printer's sort of perfection of technique. So by unhinging the screen and holding it in my hand, I found that there start appearing all these glitches in the artwork that are starting to allow the viewer to consider the work outside of the realm of print. That's sort of where I was starting with this unhinging process. And then with that process, at first I was creating abstract images, because I was more interested in seeing how this material language can affect the viewer rather than the content affecting the viewer. And so from that, I started progressing into more figurative components and incorporating, for example, photographic components of eyes and starting to create images of what I call masks. So the masked content in the work becomes representative of this idea of a performed identity, which is thought of as wearing a mask.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, because I feel like as you're speaking, of course, we're talking about prints versus painting and perceived value, but of course, we talk about identity and passing among humans in those exact terms, whether it's sort of race, gender, class, all of that, and this idea of sort of performing in order to, in a way, make your own perceived value by society, maybe more so than what identities you were born to in its own way. Yeah.
Yeah, that's where the sort of conceptual richness of my interrogation is happening, because this sort of idea of impression management in printmaking can be used metaphorically to examine impression management in humans, which is very often used to also manage stigma and stereotype and marginalization. And this idea of passing that you spoke of, this sort of idea of a person of color who can pass for white, let's say, might avoid marginalization, and the benefits and pitfalls of that situation. Like there are positive things that can come out from avoiding marginalization is positive, but then there's this idea of, well, if I'm passing for something that I'm not, how true am I being to myself? And there's a shame associated with that. And there's all these sort of issues that I'm finding are one-to-one copies of what happens in print and printmaking.
Mm-hmm.
You'll find also in the printmaking world, printmakers that feel that the print is marginalized and they need to pass for something else. They need to pass for painters in order to be taken seriously. But then how do you feel about the fact that you love printmaking and you need to sort of deny that in order to avoid the marginalization of the media?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it is something that I've heard artists speak to just really directly in those terms about how, I love printmaking, but in order, my gallery wants me to make paintings because, they say it takes them just as long to sell, a $6,000 print is a $60,000 painting or something like that, or $60 and 600 or 6 and 60, kind of depending on what stratosphere of the art world one is in. But it's and so they feel these sort of societal and commercial and logistical and practical pressures to move their practice in a direction that gets, or at least has the impression of perhaps having more reward in terms of even a career. So yeah, that's really, really fascinating that you're finding a way to explore that through the practice that you're working with right now. And I love it too in the way that it seems, I don't know, almost a bit like calling out an elephant in the room, is sort of saying, I think that printmakers, people in the print world don't necessarily want to always admit that there is stigma against the medium, and that it does affect, in real, sometimes very real world ways, the potential careers and livelihoods and exposure that artists get.
Yes. Yeah, look, this sort of, which printmaker has not thought about this notion of the marginalization of print? And, is it a real thing? Is it not a real thing? Do we want to talk about it? Do we want to be do we want to have the chip on the shoulder? Do we want to have do we want to be the sour grapes that always complains about, oh, I'm not taken seriously because I'm making prints.
Right.
You never know if it's because you're making prints or you're making bad art.
Yeah. Yeah, and it's something that I certainly think about in this podcast, and it's really where the tagline comes from of the kind of the shun the non-believers is this idea of, kind of rather than, being that kind of sour grape, that whiner, that sort of like, oh, no one will ever understand lino cut, like just saying like, we have our own value within our own society, and we don't need to look for that external validation in terms of our practice, but it also would be, I think, unwise to just completely ignore the fact that it does exist, that people can get feedback from a gallery when they make a submission of their beautiful, stunning, technically stellar lithographs. Oh, we only show real art, or we only show originals. And that happens to people, and we shouldn't ignore the fact that that happens. Yeah.
I've gotten the real art line from a gallerist.
Yeah. Oh, no. Yeah.
I actually, I remember this because I was a second year student, and it was the first exhibition I ever had to work in a commercial gallery. And it was this print that I made it was like a city skyline with a figure, and it was all constructed out of like pages from the phone book. If anybody remembers, well, printmakers remember what a phone book is.
Yeah, we still got to use them. Yeah.
But the gallerist sold the work, which was great, and then said to me like, "Oh, you know that you should actually really be making paintings of these." And I'm like, I'm a second year student learning how to make prints, and you're telling me that I need to make paintings, and what do I make of this? And I don't paint, quote unquote. That was always my thing. I don't paint.
Right.
But that's part of the field. What are you gonna do?
Yeah.
And you were saying about, the need for external validation. I still haven't overcome that need, so I tell myself it's human nature, but doesn't everybody want, external validation?
Oh, it never hurts, Absolutely. Absolutely. So you've recently had an exhibition at the Wagga Wagga Art Gallery that I believe just closed in January, so really just a few months ago now. And it was called The Masks I Wear to Pass. And looking back at your work, it seems like identity has been a theme of exploration, from like Double Coding, which is the series from 2013, and through now. And I'm wondering what kind of draws you to that subject. You spoke a little bit about kind of your immigrant experiences. Do you think that's sort of like the heart of it, as someone who's grown up on different parts of the world? And, I can speak to, as someone who's lived in, 3 different countries at this point, how you think a lot about your identity when you show up somewhere new, because you don't have any of the markers that you usually use to reflect back to yourself about who you are. Like friends are gone, restaurants are gone, that kind of thing. But I'm just sort of curious for you, maybe kind of why it's a theme for you, and what maybe you've kind of discovered through using your art practice as a way to explore it.
Yes, I think the immigrant experience is very, it's really a way for people to have a new understanding of their identity. And I think that's primarily because if you imagine, so you moved from the United States to Australia and to Thailand. So if you imagine you're living in the United States, you're surrounded by Americans. And while Americans are obviously not a homogenous identity, and there is this idea of American identity. Mm-hmm. And so your American identity doesn't stick out, when you're surrounded by Americans. And I'm pretty sure that your American identity sticks out when you're surrounded by Thai people.
A little bit, yeah. It can.
A little bit. Yeah. So, like I said, I was born in the United States, and as you can probably hear, I have an American accent when I speak in English. And I grew up in Israel, and then I moved to Australia. And I'm Jewish, so that's also part of it. And my Jewishness, for example, when I was in Israel, I was surrounded by Jewish people, and so my Jewishness was a non-event, was not something that I ever thought about. Mm-hmm. But once I moved to Australia, and you're not surrounded by people that are like you in that sense, you start thinking more and more about what that means and what are the implications of having that identity, like implications to myself, not to other people. And beyond that, like you were talking about my Wagga Wagga exhibition, the masks I wear to pass, and Jewishness is an otherness. It's what's called an invisible otherness.
Mm-hmm.
So it's an otherness that can be concealed. I can pass as not Jewish. That's not a problem for me because I don't dress up like an Orthodox Jew, and if I was standing next to you or talking to you, you'd have no idea that I was Jewish, and you know might make inappropriate comments or might make some jokes about Jewish people and stuff like that would make, and you wouldn't think twice about it. So that sort of invisible otherness was very interesting for me when I was approaching this examination of the notion of passing, because I can choose whether I pass or I don't pass as Jewish.
Yeah.
And on the same level, not looking at Judaism, but looking at my personal immigrant status. Like I mentioned, I have an American accent. And so in Australia, the first thing everybody asks me is like, oh, where in the United States are you from? And at that point, I have the opportunity to tell them, oh, no, actually, I'm not from the United States. I'm from Israel. Or I can tell them, whatever, from California.
Right.
And that I make those decisions based on what sort of future I think I have with these people. If it's somebody that I'm meeting for 5 seconds, then I'm not going to bother wasting my energy telling them about my life history. I'm just gonna brush them off and say that I'm from California, and then they inevitably say something about the United States, and I'm like, yeah, and we go our different ways. And so these are all parts of the performed self, like, do I want to perform American to somebody? Do I want to perform Israeli to somebody? I've been in Australia for 20 years. I'm an Australian national now. I can truly say I am Australian. Maybe I'm not born Australian, but I am Australian. And so, this idea of passing and performed selves and who we want to pass for, in some cases we can control it, and in some cases we can't.
I'm thinking about kind of, your experience and particularly having been an Australian immigrant myself, and, the nature of Australia as it is a country largely populated by immigrants, like the United States, like Canada. It has this colonial history, and it's a city like Sydney that's extremely multicultural, as you mentioned before, that sort of walking around, and for me, walking around as a white blonde lady, it would only be, sort of opening my mouth and speaking in an American accent that someone might be like, oh, you're not from here, to the extent that white Australians can be quote unquote from Australia. And that way that that it changes the way people perceive you. And as soon as, generally speaking, the more information people gain about people, they start to kind of put them in boxes and ways of understanding them, of like, oh, so Miranda's not Australian, she's American. And, you kind of see just the way it's just being formed. And anyway, it's just a really interesting idea, this idea of an invisible identity, and, what you kind of choose to show, and all of these calculations that are going on as we interact with other humans kind of behind the scenes, that can be based on, convenience. Like you said, like, I just don't really feel like getting into my life story. I'm from California. Or safety for some people, it's like, I don't really think that I'd be safe letting this person know that I'm queer, even though they sort of haven't clocked by looking at me or speaking to me that I am. Or, kind of maybe even perceived social climbing, that if I can, let them know that I'm from a social class like them, or like, oh yes, I had a summer abroad in Italy too. Like, now we're bonded. Like, don't you feel better about me now? I was able to afford to do that kind of thing. It's something that I think people can do so much, consciously, subconsciously, nefariously, innocently. It's just such a deep vein to mine.
Yeah, well, those are all real world examples of this performed self that I'm talking of, and the framework that I'm using, which is Irving Goffman's presentation of self, argues that there is no authentic self. We're always wearing a mask, and so the most authentic, quote unquote, authentic self that you can wear is what he calls the sincere mask, which is the most aligned with what you truly believe yourself to be. Um, but the sincere mask is we put it on and take it off all the time, and we present ourselves. We're always undergoing impression management as far as trying to control how other people perceive us. And the works that I had at the Wagga Wagga exhibition were also, as far as the material process goes, trying to have that sort of fluidity and ambiguity that I experience through my Jewishness, which is I have the capacity to turn it on and turn it off. And so in the works there, I try to trigger signifiers or indices, both of printmaking and of painting, that it will depend on how far or how close you are to the work, or it'll depend on how much knowledge you have about how prints are made.
Right.
And so I make these works that are meant to trigger different interpretations that then become dependent on the viewer. So the performance is out there, and then the viewer, like you said earlier, people are used to boxing you in or stereotyping you in order to better understand who you are. So these people come to a situation with a lifetime of preconceived notions and experiences. And so the preconceived notions and the experiences that the viewers bring to my artworks will, in the end, affect the way in which they perceive or choose to acknowledge those artworks.
Yeah. Yeah. Really, really interesting stuff. Has the fact that the word mask and what it means to us dramatically changed in the last 18 months because of the COVID pandemic, has that affected at all, you think, the way your work is perceived or even the way you see it? I know it's a totally different kind of mask, but there's no doubt that that word, as it appears in our lexicon in English globally, has suddenly really taken on a different meaning, or a different maybe initial meaning when people first hear it.
So surprisingly, yes, but in a very in a very tangential way. It's at like if you would have asked me this 6 months ago, then I would have said a resounding no. But there is a little bit of connection, and my connection to masks goes back to the material language of the print, and particularly the screen print, because the screen print is a masking process.
Right.
It's a stencil. It's a stencil process, and a stencil is a mask. And so what a mask is it's a tool that allows us to control where and which information gets through. So imagine you're wearing a mask on your face and it has eye holes and it has a mouth hole. Then your eyes and your mouth are coming through, but the rest of the information on your face is blocked. And the same thing happens on a screen. Where the mask is, or where the stencil is where that defines where the information or the image or the ink are going to go through from the matrix to the substrate. And so my interest in masks is that sort of connection of terminology between the print or the screen print being a masking process and the performed identity being as well a masking process. And those connections. And so the more I interrogate this sort of idea, the more I'm finding that there are these sort of semantic or language connections between the two processes that are strengthening my metaphor more and more. But saying that, I did realize that part of wearing a mask, for example, the COVID masks that we're wearing, or masks that we wear in the printmaking studio, is to protect us. And in the performed self, like you were saying, stigmatized people wear masks in order to protect them from what could be dangerous situations.
Yeah.
So there are those connections as well. But I don't really want my idea of masks and my use of masks to sort of mix in with
Totally.
the 2021, 2022 or 2020, 2021, 2022.
Yeah, or hopefully not 2023, 2024. Yeah.
Yeah, these masks that we're using now are they're not really what I'm talking about.
Truly,
but all masks, those masks do, like I said, they perform a function of protection, which is identical to the performed self mask that a marginalized person that's trying to pass would employ in order to protect themselves from being discovered or whatever.
Well, Ben, you've broken my brain. I will no longer be able to interact with anyone without thinking like, what am I showing? What am I concealing? Why am I trying to manipulate this? Like, I feel like it's going to be, but
no,
yeah.
Manipulation is only one. It's a really small part of that. You don't need to frame it within this sort of negative framework. It's just what we are. It's just how we are.
Yeah.
It's not, fair enough. There are people that attempt to be manipulative, or like con men, for example. Right. That's what they're doing.
Yeah.
That's exactly what they're doing. But it's not. It doesn't need to be thought of, like how we perform ourselves doesn't need to be thought of as how we manipulate other people.
I really like that idea, actually. That's going to help me as I walk away from the interview, because I think that wanting to connect with a person and find common ground is a really human thing. And you're right, it doesn't have to be manipulative and it doesn't have to be nefarious. It could just be, I'm trying to find out how you're like me and I'm like you, because I have so many different identities. And we're probably will find a way that they overlap, and choosing to point, to sort of reveal, to unmask that part of yourself can just be from a place of wanting genuine connection, wanting to have another human experience with someone who might be really different from you in other ways. So yeah, it doesn't have to be just, this kind of sociopathic, like, you're gonna like me, Yeah.
More often than not, you'll find that the sort of things that you're doing, you're actually doing for the benefit of the other person to feel comfortable.
Yeah, definitely.
Like me playing along with the person that wants to know where in the United States I'm from.
Yeah, absolutely. Please let listeners know where they can find you, where they can follow your work, where they can maybe see images of it and all that good stuff.
Okay, I'm on Instagram under the moniker of Binya666. That's BINYA 666. And I have a website that's occasionally updated at benrak.com.au. So benrak.com.au.
Well, yeah, that will be awesome. And thank you so much, Ben, for catching up with me and telling me more about your work. Always a pleasure.
It's my pleasure, Miranda. Thank you for having me. And I'm really hoping our international travel ban lifts soon, and maybe I'll find myself in Thailand. So
please,
that'd be really amazing to catch up with you and some other great friends we have there.
Yeah. You've got lots of friends, lots of print friends here. So come on up.
Cool. Thanks again, Miranda.
Well, that's our show for this week. Join me again next week when my guest will be Paul Maloney. We'll talk about his familial print history, Japan, Hawaii, and recessions. You won't want to miss it. This episode, like all episodes, was written and produced by me, Miranda Metcalf, with editing by Timothy Pauschak and music by Joshua Weber. I'll see you next week.